Hello and welcome once again to Bible Talk with Bruce and Becky. It's an unusually warm, unseasonably warm day here in Chattanooga for the last few days of February. It's probably that during global warming. We've had a very warm winter here for the most part, although other parts of the country have had record cold temperatures and snowfall. But enough about the weather.
Yeah.
Moving on to sports. No, just kidding. Well, if you've been following us, you know that we have finished our long study of the book of Genesis. If you haven't been following us and are interested in learning more about Genesis, we have some 36 episodes on our YouTube channel. I believe you just go to Don't Send Money Bible Talk. But now we're going to skip from Genesis, the first book of the Bible, to Revelation, the last book. Big jump. But we'll find that there are connections between the two books.
About 64 of them.
A little Bible humor.
Very little.
Well, let's begin our look at the book of Revelation. It's a book that certainly requires some introductory matters in order to interpret it correctly. It's not the kind of book that someone who's not familiar with the Bible can just begin reading and get the full meaning from it. So we'll talk today about some introductory matters, beginning with the title of the book, which will also reveal to us the literary genre. I just love saying the word genre. I'm not sure exactly why. But it is an almost unique book in the Bible. And the first word in the Greek text, which it was originally written in, is apocalypsis.
Whoops.
Apocalypsis Jesu Christu. An apocalypse of Jesus Christ. When we hear the word apocalypse in our modern times and society, what do you think most people think about, Becky?
Scary stuff.
Scary stuff. Uh, there's a lot of movies that are made that are called post-apocalyptic, where something terrible has happened to our culture and society.
Dystopian.
Dystopian. But that's not the original meaning or the biblical meaning of the word apocalypse. It literally means an unveiling or a revelation. Which brings me to my first use of one of my pet peeves. You'll hear me say this repeatedly. There is no S on the end of that title. It is not Revelations, plural. It is a revelation or an apocalypse of Jesus Christ, an unveiling. I sometimes use the analogy of the drama, the theater, the stage, where there's often an opening of the curtain at the beginning of the play. That's what we have in this book of Apocalypse. A curtain is opened to reveal to us another realm, another world. It's the world, the heavenly world, the spiritual world. And it reveals not so much things in the distant future, but what's going on right now in this spiritual realm, which is connected to events that are happening in our material world. Does that make sense, young lady? So we're going to have an unveiling, a revealing of Jesus Christ. So it is called apocalyptic literature. There were many apocalypses written around the same time as this one, mostly among the Jewish people, that involved revealing things in the spiritual world. This is the one that's most well known. There are no other apocalyptic books in the Bible, although there are apocalyptic sections in some of the books. In the New Testament, we have, for example, Matthew chapter 24 and its parallel passages in Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. That passage is sometimes called the little apocalypse, or little, short, small, compact, or sometimes the Olivet discourse of Jesus.
Because he was on the Mount of Olives.
He's on the Mount of Olives, across from Jerusalem. He and his disciples are looking down at the temple. They remark on what a beautiful building it is. And in fact, the Jerusalem temple that Herod had almost finished restoring was considered widely, even among the Gentiles, as the most beautiful temple in the world. And the saying was, you've never seen a temple till you've seen the temple in Jerusalem. The disciples remarked on how beautiful that building was, and Jesus said, the time is coming when not one stone will be left on another, but the whole thing will be torn down. And he goes on to give the signs of that approaching destruction by the Romans in AD 70, and perhaps also a little bit about his second coming and the end of time. There are also several apocalyptic sections in the Old Testament, specifically Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7, the second part of the book of Zechariah, and some parts of Ezekiel. And those are referred to or alluded to in the book of Revelation. In fact, here's a little something to file away in your Bible trivia file. You got it?
Okay.
Revelation, or the Apocalypse, has more allusions to the Old Testament than any other New Testament book, although it's hard to find a single direct quotation.
Gotcha.
It's almost as if this writer was so familiar with the Old Testament that he can't write a book without so many references to Old Testament thought and language. And speaking of the writer, who wrote the Apocalypse, Becky?
John the Revelator.
John the Revelator. Or he just gives his name as John several times, 3 times, I believe, in the book. So the question comes up, which John is this?
He was that one.
It's the one who wrote the book. There are several Johns, I believe at least 6 mentioned in the New Testament. It was a fairly common name in those days. Ioannos, or Ioannes in Greek, or Yochanan in Hebrew. The consensus from the early days of church history is that the Apostle John, son of Zebedee and brother of the Apostle James, wrote the book. I, however, hold to a minority position.
You would.
I would, and I'm holding on pretty strongly. I believe that with another John, for a few reasons, the main one of which is I've read it in Greek several times, and it doesn't sound like the other books of the New Testament that we believe were written by the Apostle John, that is the 4th Gospel and the 3 letters of John.
Well, it doesn't really sound like any book in the New Testament.
No, just sections of it. But if it's by the same author, you would think there would be more similarity, or I would.
Okay.
Just saying.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying.
Oh, you better not. Consequences could be grave.
Oh, dear.
Sounds like a threat. And also, he gives his name repeatedly. In the 4 Johannine books they're referred to, he's careful to conceal his name. Unlike Paul, who always begins his letters by giving his name, the writer of those referred to himself indirectly. For example, the disciple whom Jesus loved. But it won't be on the final exam, I don't think. So you can believe whoever wrote it. We're just going to refer to him as John. And also, talking about the genre of the book, he calls this book several times a prophecy. Prophecy.
Did you say which John it is?
I said another John besides the apostle. We
Oh,
don't know any more
okay. So
about
you.
his identity than that.
Oh, okay.
He had been exiled apparently to the Isle of Patmos, he says, for the testimony of Jesus. So maybe he was being punished with exile. Prophecy in the Bible does not primarily refer to predicting the future. That's the way people take it in the popular mind. But prophecy means, more specifically, speaking a word from God to the people. Prophets are more interested in ethical behavior than they are in predicting the future, so they are spokespersons for God. So this book is a prophecy meant to teach us more about Jesus and how we should behave as his followers, especially when we encounter opposition or even persecution. It's written to 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia, sometimes called Asia Minor, to distinguish it from Asia and the Far East. Okay, Becky knows and will inform us what modern country is in the same territory that biblical Asia was.
Turkey.
Turkey, that's right.
Are any of them in Syria?
No,
No, just Turkey.
just Turkey. Some of them in areas where the terrible earthquake has recently occurred in Turkey. So we have an apocalyptic book, that is a book that's going to reveal heavenly things to us, a prophecy, a word from God to his people, and it does involve some prediction of the future, at least from the future of the original readers.
Would you call it a vision?
It has a lot of visions in it, yes. It's not entirely a vision, especially chapter 2 and 3, but yes, there are visions. And what is a vision?
It, okay, this is my opinion.
Give it.
It's almost like a dream sent from God. It's very symbolic, and I think it reaches your heart as well as your brain, and it speaks to your whole being.
Very good, Becky. You get the A plus for today. Vision has sometimes been called a waking dream. The person is not asleep, but they are seeing things that they would not ordinarily see in our conscious state. And you mentioned symbols. One characteristic of this book is it's very symbolic. Now that goes against some of the popular interpretations of today, given by what I would call self-anointed prophecy experts. And you can see them or hear them on TV or on the internet, always telling you how the book should be taken, and most of them say it's to be taken literally. I beg to differ. In fact, I would go so far as to say no one has ever been able to interpret all of this book literally. For example, just to give one glaring example that we'll come back to later, the final battle between good and evil pictured in Revelation is sometimes called the Battle of Armageddon. If you take the description of that battle literally, then it is fought by armies riding on horseback and fighting with swords, spears, and bows and arrows,
And chariots.
and chariots, mostly on horseback, however, cavalry. Well, everyone agrees that that Battle of Armageddon is in the future from our standpoint. And as we notice from the Ukrainian war, for example, wars nowadays are fought with modern technology. Why would we revert to horseback, bows and arrows, spears and swords for the final battle? Well, even the literal interpreters don't interpret that battle literally. They have, for example, a locust army in another part of the book. Strange locusts with heads and hair like a lion, or hair like a lion and faces like human beings. Hal Lindsey, to mention one literal interpreter, says that's a description of attack helicopters.
Of course.
And up to that point, Hal has gone to great lengths to make fun of people who take the book symbolically. Well, if interpreting a locust as a helicopter is not symbolic, I don't know what is. But anyway, I'm going to argue that the book is not to be taken literally for the most part. But let me show one reason for that. In the first verse, John says that God signified this book to his people. He signified it. You have the first verse there, Becky.
It says he made it known.
Made it known. He uses a Greek word that means to communicate symbolically or spiritually. He tells us in the very beginning, this book is symbolic in nature. It signifies something. It's a book of signs that point to some meaning beyond the literal meaning. Well, let's, unless you have something further to question or add.
Yeah, I think we should talk about the purpose of the book.
We're gonna.
Okay.
You want to talk about it first? What do you think is the purpose?
Well, I know how it's been used contemporaneously because I have people who do this, acquaintances, etc. They use it to scare people to death and say the Lord's going to be here tomorrow and everything's going to fall apart and you're going to be tortured, so you better accept Jesus.
Okay. You think that's the purpose?
No.
I don't either. Partly because it's written to believers, to Christians, 7 churches in the province of Asia. The purpose is to reveal something about Jesus Christ and his people and what we may encounter because we are believers. It's also called a testimony. And the believers are referred to sometimes as those who bear witness. The purpose of the book is to tell us, as I said before, how to behave as Christians in this difficult world where there's great opposition to us.
And it's a comfort. It's almost as if these people who are being tortured and persecuted, etc., for being Christians, have a vision of this coming justification, the ultimate revenge of God on all evil, and the ultimate beautification of the church, and so on. And you open your eyes and you think it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
Good. It tells us about the triumph of God's kingdom. 2 kingdoms are described in this book, a kingdom of good and a kingdom of evil, also referred to as 2 cities, the city of the beast and the city of God, are 2 women, the great harlot or whore and the beautiful bride of Christ. Let's talk a little bit more about symbolic language and communication. You mentioned earlier it communicates to the heart as well as the mind. Some years ago in graduate school at Florida State, I took a course in mythology, and we talked about the language of mythology, which is also the language of dreams, the language of the imagination, even the language of the subconscious. There's more to us than just rational thought. And symbols.
I'm certainly not terribly rational.
Well, at times. But fairy tales, for example, communicate through symbols. And some of the symbols are the same ones found in our dreams. It's the part of our mind that is not always conscious to us, but can appeal to us emotionally, imaginatively, And this is that kind of communication. It's not like the historical narratives. It's not telling us necessarily historical details. It's telling us things that appeal to us emotionally, some of it quite frightening, some of it quite joyous, worshipful, but it's the language of another part of our mind or ourselves that is not necessarily found in most of the Bible. How much time has elapsed? Can you?
We are 20 minutes in.
Let me say just briefly some things about how this book has been interpreted throughout history. This is definitely a book that cries out for interpretation, and there are some 4 or 5 different ways that it's been interpreted. The first one is usually called the idealist approach. Idealist. This finds principles in Revelation that would communicate to any time period or people in any culture. Uh, in its most extreme form, the idealist approach says there's nothing historical in the book, uh, but it's general principles or spiritual principles that we should learn, especially when we're facing a hostile world in opposition to Christianity. Well, do you see any weaknesses in that approach, Becky?
Well, for one thing, the writer says these are things that are shortly going to happen.
That's right. Twice he says in the first paragraph, these are things that are just about to happen. The time is near, he says. The same message that Jesus preached in Galilee, according to the Gospel of Mark. The time is fulfilled, Jesus said. Repent and believe the gospel, for the time is at hand. The kingdom of God is about to be set up. Uh, so there is a timeless approach in there, but it also ignores the first part of the book, the letters to the 7 churches. If it doesn't have anything to do with their historical situation, why did it spend 2 chapters talking to them? Well, another approach is called historicist. The historicist approach.
Write this down.
You take notes, it might be on the final. This one holds that the book of Revelation begins at the time of John in the 1st century and goes throughout history till the final coming of Christ, focusing on certain historical events in symbolic language. So it's kind of a map of history written ahead of time.
The book of Daniel was such.
There's some in Daniel like that. But the weakness of this approach has always been interpreters can't agree on what historical periods are being discussed symbolically. And they do a good job of interpreting history up to their own time. But if they try to carry it on to the future, they are not very accurate. And none of these historicists can agree on what historical events are being described. And they miss some big ones. For example, World War I and II. Nobody's interpreted them in light of the book of Revelation. Or how about the pandemic that we have just gone through?
Well, there have been several throughout history.
Yes, but none of this one has not been described, nor the great flu pandemic of 1918 or so. Lots of big chunks of history are overlooked in Revelation, and it also ignores the 1st century situation in which it was written to the 7 churches. Let me give you a general principle of interpretation. Call this the Bruceist approach.
Write that down.
Any interpretation of Revelation must have meaning for the original readers as well as any who read it throughout time, even to our time. If you ignore the original setting, you're going to go wrong in your interpretation. But if it doesn't apply to us as well,
There's
then
no point in having it in the Bible right now.
yeah. And there's certainly parts of the book of Revelation that apply to the end of history and the second coming. Well, another approach has been called preterist.
Treacherous?
Preterist, Preterist, from the Latin word preter, which means the past. This approach says almost all, or some extreme preterists will say all of the book has to do only with the first century, and that it was all fulfilled with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Even what seems to be the end of history was really just the end of that world, the Jewish world, and the Jewish temple and so on. Well, that's pretty extreme, and again, it leaves us out of the picture.
But it's kind of, when I was a part of a group that believed that way, it was kind of comforting to read all of that horrible stuff and think, well, that's in the past. I don't have to deal with that.
Right. But it's not relevant to us in the same way it would have been relevant to them. I would say the little apocalypse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke focuses mainly on the destruction of Jerusalem, if you read it in context, but also seems to include the end of history. So preterists can go to extreme, however, they do emphasize the original meaning of the book, which we don't want to overlook. And the final approach, or the perhaps penultimate approach, is the futurist, which is the most popular nowadays.
The world of tomorrow.
That's right. It's tomorrow's headlines written ahead of time. And it interprets the events, especially in the Middle East, and Russia and Ukraine and so on, that are going on now. Big problem with the futurist approach, which focuses almost primarily on the last generation of human history, is that it even tries to predict the coming of Christ. All who have tried to predict future events through this approach, everyone, 100% without exception, who have written and taught about it to this point, have been wrong.
That doesn't mean it isn't going to happen.
No, but if 100% of the interpreters are wrong in what they say about history, about coming events, maybe there's something wrong with the approach. For example, a lot of these are date setters. I remember one guy who wrote a book a while back in the 80s, 101 Reasons That Christ Will Return in 1988.
He didn't, did he?
He did.
No.
Oh, he wrote the book.
He wrote the book.
If Christ came in 1988, we all missed it. So guess what happened at the end of 1988?
Wrote another book.
101 Reasons That Christ Will Return in 1989.
Oh, dear.
Now, you can do that every year until eventually you get it right. But something...
Is he going to run out of reasons?
No, you can always come up with more reasons if you're taking that approach. I am poking a bit of fun, although I do take these interpretations seriously as far as examining the book.
And Jesus is going to come.
He will come. But he himself said, as I recall, no one knows the day or the hour. Not the angels in heaven, not the Son, that is himself, only the Father.
That's weird.
I remember reading one book that says we can't know the day or the hour, but we can know the month and the year.
Oh, well.
Take that for what it's worth. Hal Lindsey, who is still, I saw him on TV recently, still doing his prophetic interpretation, has had to revise his works several times. The Jehovah's Witnesses, who have been big date setters, have predicted at least 10 different time periods that Christ would come back. They've been proven wrong every time so far. So I don't think that's what the book is about either. Well, our time is about up. We'll begin here next week, but I'll tell you the approach we're going to use.
I'm waiting.
The eclectic approach. What does eclectic mean?
It means you grab something here and here and here and you throw it in a pot.
And you bring it to a boil? Stir it occasionally? Yes, eclectic means we'll take the good parts from every interpretation, but we'll let the book interpret itself.
But when is he coming?
In the future.
Okay.
But he himself said twice in the first chapter, the time is near. He says it again in the last chapter. The time is near. It's always near.
Well, it's nearer than it was.
It's nearer than it ever was before. That's true. Well, there's much more to be said about the book of Revelation, but this is a good pausing place. We'll begin looking at chapter 1 next time, Lord willing, and if he doesn't come before then. If Christ comes back before our next episode, class is dismissed.
Thank you for watching.
And remember,
Don't send money.
God bless you.